assembling and disassembling a system unit. Now, before we start, if you're planning to assemble or disassemble a system unit, please make sure to treat the components with care, not like this. Because if you break something like your CPU, GPU, or even your motherboard, well, rest in peace your wallet. Now, before we start, we need a table as our workspace. Now, you will be also needing a screwdriver, but since this is my own personal computer, I won't be needing one because I'm afraid that I might break the CPU. Now, first thing you will need to do is by opening up the side panel by lifting this lever right here, and mine is very hard to open. My system unit is very old, so it has a lever holding it in place, but modern system units, you actually just have to slide it outwards, but they also have thumb screws holding them in. Now we need to unplug any cables out of the way, like SATA cables and power cables, so we can work on the system unit much better. Now that the SATA cables are now removed, time to move on the power cables. Now that the power cables are removed, time to move on to the optical drive and the hard disk drives inside the PC. Now, to work on this much more easier, you can actually pull right under that green arrow where my hand is right now. By pulling that, you can actually lift its tray, but modern system units don't have this. They actually have screws holding them in. Now, to release the optical drive, you have to push this button here and pull the optical drive and pull it up, and it should release. Now here I actually tried to do another demonstration, but I actually did this, which you shouldn't do because it may damage the component. Now the proper way to do it is actually like this. Next up is a hard drive, but mine doesn't have screws, so I could just pull it straight up. But if yours does have screws, the way to remove it is by pushing it in towards the computer and lifting it out. Now I do have a second hard drive. It's a laptop hard drive. I just found this laying around our house not being used, so I decided to use it and make a makeshift stand for it so it won't be laying on its own power cord. Next up is the power supply. First, lift up the power supply and locate where its cables are plugged into. Now to release the power supply cable, just hold this lever right there and just squeeze it and pull it out gently, and give it a little wiggle if it won't come out. And now just do the same thing on the other power supply cables. Now it comes to the actual power supply. Now what you do here is lifting it up slightly, pulling it towards you, and lifting it up completely. Next up is the graphics card. First, flip this latch up and completely flip it over, which should release the graphics card I/O shield. Now there is another lock for the GPU. It is a lever. Now the way to release this is by pushing it to the side away from the GPU. which should release the other side of the GPU and let the GPU slide up. Now next up is the RAM. It is located where I just zoomed in. Now each RAM module actually has two latches on each side holding it down. To release the RAM, you just have to push down on both latches, which would lift the RAM off its slot. Now next up would be the CPU, but sadly this is a working system unit, so I can't remove the CPU because I'm afraid that I might break the CPU or the motherboard. But before you remove the CPU, the cooler is held by 4 screws, which is located on each corner of the cooler. And then you should see the CPU. First you have to pull this lever to the side and lift it up towards you. This should allow you to lift up this bracket right here and lets you remove the CPU from its socket. Next up is the motherboard. Each motherboard has 6 to 9 screws holding it down in place. Now removing the motherboard is just really self-explanatory. Just locate the screws and unscrew them and just take out the motherboard out of the case carefully and gently. Now next up is the assembly, and it's just the same way as disassembling but backwards. Now next up we will be doing the RAM, which is pretty easy. But if you have 4 or more slots and you want to run your RAM on dual channel, there's actually a configuration which is A1, B1, A2, and B2. They will be also color coded, so what you can do is actually match the color of the RAM slot. For example, if you put your first RAM on the black slot, put your second RAM on the second black slot, so it's much more easier to recognize. Now before actually putting your RAM in, as you can see, it has a notch. Align this notch with the bump inside your RAM slot, which actually prevents you from putting the RAM backwards. Now next thing you should do is push down your RAM, and if you hear 2 clicks, this means your RAM is now locked in place. Now next up is the hard drive. Again, mine doesn't have screws, but if yours do, all you have to do is actually align the screws with the hole and push it down gently and slide it out. That should lock it in place. And all you have to do is do the same thing to the optical drive. Now you also have to do the same thing to the power supply, but modern system units you actually just have to screw it in. Now just plug in all the power cables on their dedicated ports. Now I will just plug in this 4-pin power cable that powers my 2 hard drives and my optical drive. And now just plug in this L-shaped power cable to my hard drives and my optical drive. Next up, the SATA cables. And now just do some wire management while I'm at it for a better and clean look. Last but not least, the graphics card. Now putting this in is just the same as the RAM modules. It's really just self-explanatory. And now time to put the side panel in just to cover everything up. And now just plug in your input and output peripheral devices. And now everything should be working fine.